Hi, do you have object permanence?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Like a blue arrow.
There are a lot of major theories out there regarding human development, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of the most influential ones. Now, perhaps the most influential theory of human development was proposed by Jean Piaget. And Piaget believed that all children pass through 4 separate stages of cognitive development in their early life. And this is pretty similar to what Freud's ideas were. We're not going to really talk about Freud's developmental theories just yet. We'll get to that in a different video. But Piaget believed that the child's intellect grows depending on, whether or not they meet these kinds of, demands during these different stages. So the first stage is the sensorimotor stage. During the sensorimotor stage, the child is learning to make sense of the environment. That's the sensory part. But they're also learning how to control their muscles. That's the motor part. So they're developing coordination while they're learning about their environment. So most of this development is nonverbal. Children between the age of 0 to 2, they don't really talk that much. So a lot of parents think that they're not really learning that much, but they are definitely learning. They're learning an incredible amount of information. It's just nonverbal stuff that they're learning. Now, something that we know, something that seems quite clear, is that children in this stage, children in this sensorimotor stage, they lack the ability to have like a mental imagery. They cannot create internal mental representations of things. And along with that, they lack what's called object permanence. So that just means that when something is hidden from them, when something moves out of their field of vision, from their perspective, that thing has ceased to exist, or that thing has completely disappeared. It's not that that thing is just around the corner. It's that it's gone, right? And that's why playing peekaboo with a very young child is so amusing to them, because you are literally like appearing and disappearing. You're like a wizard. The next stage is between the ages of about 2 to 7. This is the preoperational stage, where children start to develop their mental imagery. And you can tell that they're developing their mental imagery because they'll start to do things like pretend play, have imaginary kind of friends, and create little stories with their toys where their toys are interacting and there's like a complex narrative. Also, this is around the time when children start to become afraid of the dark. Fear of the dark is definitely related to having this kind of internal mental world. Of course, the consequence of having a good imagination is that you could also scare yourself by imagining scary things in the darkness. But while they have a good mental world, while they have a good mental imagery, they lack the ability to really be, creative. All they can really do is to just think about things in a very basic way, but they can't really combine them. They can't really transform their mental images in any really kind of basic creative way. What I'm trying to say is, if I ask you to think of a whale elephant, you'll probably be able to do that. You'll probably be able to imagine something that is part whale and part elephant. But for a child during this stage, that's incredibly difficult. They might be able to do it, but it's very, very difficult because they've never seen a whale elephant, so they can't possibly imagine one. Also, children during this preoperational stage tend to be intuitive and egocentric. By intuitive, I just mean they don't use logic and reason. They just use their feelings. They use their intuition. And as a result, they're easily tricked by illusions. So that's a good reason why you might want to have an illusionist come to your young child's party, because this person's basically a wizard to them. Like, they don't understand how this could possibly be done. And they also tend to be egocentric. What I mean by that is the child is unable to accommodate the viewpoints of others. They're literally self-centered. They simply cannot understand the world from somebody else's perspective. I'm not saying that they're mean necessarily, it's just they lack the ability to see it from your point of view. So if they kick another little kid in the shin and that kid starts crying, you might get mad and say something like, you're not supposed to kick people. Why did you do that? And the child could literally respond by saying, I don't understand what the problem is. I'm not in pain. The next stage is the concrete operational stage. This is where children become able to carry out various kinds of complex mental operations and really start to transform their mental images. They also understand things like logic and reason and can think about things in a much more scientific kind of a way. You could say that this is more or less the scientific stage of child's development. But their thinking is still very simple, very concrete. They can't really think about anything abstract or in the distant future. It isn't until the child reaches the formal operational stage, which is about the age of 11 on, where the child can really start to think about abstract ideas, like abstract principles, like concepts and examples that do not have any real physical, concrete, presence. So ideas like justice, love, friendship, these kinds of abstract ideas are things that they can and often do consider. They also think a lot about hypothetical possibilities, so that during this stage, children are able to start, thinking about the consequences of various actions that they might take, and as a result, they're, much more likely to plan for the future. They're less likely to just, do things and suffer the consequence unknowingly. So those are the 4 stages of Piaget's theory. Now, a lot of modern researchers believe that Piaget underestimated children's thinking skills. For example, we've seen many examples of children that do not have this egocentrism, even though they aren't even 7 years of age yet. They're what I'm saying is very, very young children, as early as the age of 4, seem to have this ability to overcome egocentrism. So while this is definitely something that all children go through, depending on the parenting styles, depending on the environment and the genes, some children can, mature much faster. And I have a link in the comments down here regarding, what it's like for a child to have egocentrism. And you can do something similar to what you see in the video to test if your child still has an egocentric perspective. Another major theorist was Erik Erikson. Now, he argued that there's 8 separate stages, and during each stage, the child has to perform a developmental task. So this is like a skill that they have to master or a personal change that has to take place for the child to develop normally. The first stage is trust versus mistrust, where the children are completely dependent on others. Remember, during the age of 0 to 1, which is when this stage is, the child can't really move. They're virtually immobile and they're completely dependent on other people. So they'll learn to trust others if they are given that kind of contact comfort we talked about before. If they're shown affection, if they're held, if they're hugged and things like that. If the child doesn't receive adequate contact comfort, then they'll develop mistrust. That if their parents are unpredictable or just unwilling to enrich their environment in this way. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt, and that's between the ages of 1 to 3. Now, by autonomy, I just mean they want to learn to do things for themselves. This is when the child will say things like, "No, I do it," and they want to put on their own shoes, and they struggle, and they fail, and they get upset. But it's important to let the child try to do it themselves. If the parents are too overprotective or ridiculing, then the children will learn to doubt their abilities, and they'll feel shameful for their failures. The third stage is initiative versus guilt, and that's between the ages of 3 to 5. By initiative, I just mean that the parents need to give the children freedom. The children need to feel like they can explore and use their imagination and ask questions. If the children aren't allowed to show this kind of initiative, then they'll start to feel guilty. They'll start to feel like they shouldn't be an inquisitive person. So parents can avoid this by not criticizing them or preventing them from exploring and things like that, and putting up with all those questions that they get. The fourth stage is industry versus inferiority. That's between the ages of 6 to 12. And this is the primary stage where you're going to start to accumulate a lot of that horrible refrigerator art. Because what the child is trying to do during the stage is be productive. They want to be a productive member of this household. That's what I mean by industry. So the child wants to do something that they get praised for and they feel like they've contributed. If they don't feel industrious, if they don't feel like a contributing member of the family, then they'll develop an inferiority problem where they'll feel like they can't do anything right. They'll feel like their work is inadequate or messy. Now, after this stage, that's when most children will hit puberty. Puberty is that rapid, change of physical characteristics related to sexuality. And you have two basic kinds of sex characteristics. The primary sex characteristics, basically genitals and the reproductive organs. And then the secondary sex characteristics, which is everything else associated with being a man or a woman that doesn't really have to do with reproduction. So that would be things like facial hair, a deeper voice, large breasts, things like that. And when a child hits puberty, that's when their sexual interest awakens, and it will continually increase throughout their teenage years. Stage 5, that's identity versus role confusion. So children during this stage, they're trying to determine their identity. They're trying to decide what kind of a person do they want to be, what kind of life do they want to have. The unfortunate thing for a lot of parents is that children don't often want the parents to, be a part of this identity search. And children who have a lot of trouble finding out who they are will suffer from role confusion, where they'll just kind of go throughout life not really knowing which direction to go, what to do, what to like, who to be friends with, and things like that. But most children will help determine their identity before they reach their early 20s. So they'll get a basic sense of what kind of person do they want to be before they become an adult. And when they become an adult, that's when they're really going to start exploring their, possible paths they can take in life, like the kind of careers they might want to head towards, or whether or not they want to have children, things like that. But even though people of this age are expected, in some cases required, to make these important lifetime decisions, the neuroimaging research that's been done on people of this age argues that they shouldn't be required. They shouldn't have that kind of responsibility yet, because the frontal parts of the lobe, the parts of the lobe that are responsible for these kinds of, really important kinds of decisions, are still immature, and they will continue to mature through the early 20s. So if your parents, if you're in this age range, if you're in your early 20s, and your parents are really kind of pushing you hard to, choose a career or make some other important decision in your life, you should literally tell them, neuroimaging research has conclusively shown that that part of my brain responsible for making these kinds of decisions is not fully developed, so you're being really unfair. Let's talk about it again in about 5 years. Stage 6, that's intimacy versus isolation, young adulthood, when, between the ages of about 25 to 30 or 40. This is when people are going to be focused on intimacy. So by intimacy, I don't necessarily mean being sexually intimate, but that could be part of it. It's more so about just developing a family. Sometimes a literal family, maybe in other cases, just like a family of friends or coworkers. They just want to feel close to other people. If they aren't able, for whatever reason, to become intimate like this with others, then they'll start to feel isolated. They'll start to feel alone and uncared for, and they'll fall into deep depression. So after the age of 30, physical capabilities are going to really start to decline for most individuals. It isn't until later, around the ages of 45 to 55, that women will hit menopause, where they'll cease menstruating, and that signals an end to the reproductive life. The bad news I have for men, though, is that after they hit about the age of 20, it's all downhill. So there's a gradual decline in testosterone from the age of 20 all the way down to 60. So if you're older than 20, like I am, you're going downhill fast in terms of your testosterone. Of course, you don't need high testosterone to make babies, but testosterone is the primary kind of sex hormone for men. Stage 7, that's middle or late adulthood. That's called generativity versus stagnation. During this stage, the adult is interested in generativity. All that means is just an interest in the next generation, an interest in making the world a better place, or literally making the next generation, having babies. Adults who do not show this kind of interest in children and the next generation are going to stagnate. They're just going to be completely self-centered, and that often leads to depression. Now, the last stage, stage 8, that's integrity versus despair. So that's late adulthood, it's very late in life. By integrity versus despair, I mean during this stage, the older person needs to feel self-respect. They need to feel like they've accomplished something in their life, like they've lived richly and responsibly. If they don't feel like they've lived a good life, then they'll fall into a deep depression where they'll just focus on the regrets, focus on the things that they didn't do, focus on the things that they didn't have in their life. And they'll feel a lot of heartache and remorse. When we talk about individuals in their late life, there's actually a field of research that focuses on them. It's called gerontology. So gerontology, it studies people of many ages, but it mostly focuses on the older individuals. There's been a lot of interesting findings from gerontology. One of the most interesting ones is that as a person gets older, their fluid abilities, like their abstract reasoning and mental flexibility, will diminish. So that peaks in the early 20s and it just declines as you get older. But for older individuals, they have a lot of the other kind of abilities, which are called crystallized abilities. So crystallized abilities are things that develop and continue to develop throughout your life. So we oftentimes call this something like wisdom or knowledge or whatever you want to call it. But the whole idea here is that's not going to decline as you get older, and that's going to allow you as an older individual to be very helpful and be very influential in your family and in society in general. There's also been a lot of basic advice developed by psychological research as to how to successfully age. So things that you should do to stay happy and healthy as you're getting older. So there's 3 basic components. You need to have a good physical health, you need to be able to retain your cognitive abilities, and you need to engage in social and productive activities. And the basic way you do these things is just by staying active. So stay active in your community, stay active in your family, stay physically active. Just don't allow yourself to vegetate and become stagnant. If you do these things, if you can keep yourself active as you move later into life, you'll feel a much higher degree of overall satisfaction. Now, the very last stage of development would be death, of course. So there's been a few interesting things that we've developed regarding how people react to death and how people think about death. This field of research is Thanatology. It's the study of emotional and behavioral reactions to death and dying. Now, you may have heard of one of the most major findings, one of the most major theories, these ideas that have been developed. It's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 basic reactions to death. And these aren't always experienced in the same order, and they're not experienced by everybody who is near death, but these are the 5 most basic reactions. So the first reaction that most people have is that they go into a stage of denial. So they'll deny that they are actually dying. They'll deny that this is the reality of the situation, and they'll isolate themselves from any source of information that would confirm that they are dying. Second stage, the second basic reaction is anger. So that's when they're going to start lashing out at other people. They're going to be asking questions like, why is this happening to me? Like, why am I dying and you're not? They'll often project their anger onto those who aren't dying. So a husband who's dying might get angry at his wife who is healthy. The third basic reaction is bargaining. This is when the person who's going to die starts trying to make a deal with either the doctors or their gods or whatever, but they're just trying to like weasel their way out of it. They're trying to find a shortcut or some way that they can get out of this problem. And then the fourth stage is depression, because obviously that bargaining probably isn't going to work, so now they'll feel like there's nothing they can do. They'll feel exhausted, and they'll likely just give up. They'll fall into a deep sadness. And unfortunately, most people who are dying, they do kind of get stuck in this stage. And they don't really ever get out of it because they don't, if they're dying, they don't have that much time to really deal with these feelings. But if the person does live long enough, that most of the time they will reach the final basic reaction, which is acceptance. So if the death is not sudden, they will be able to accept the fact that they're dying, accept the fact that there's nothing they can do about it, and then they should just try to live their last few moments to the fullest extent. Try to get the most out of what they have left.